Okay, welcome back, everybody. So today my guest is Dr. Analia Albuja from Northeastern University. Thank you for joining me, Dr. Albuja.
Of course, thank you for inviting me.
So we're going to talk about your very interesting recent paper about the effects of having a cross-race roommate. But before we get into that, I'd like to give the guests a more expansive opportunity to tell us a little bit about the research questions that most guide their work. So what is it that you like to study in the context of intergroup relations?
Yeah, I am really interested in social identities across a variety of different categories, but most of my work so far has looked at race and culture. And I'm interested in people who don't necessarily fit neatly into one category. So a lot of my work in graduate school looked at bicultural and biracial populations, so people who have parents of different racial backgrounds, or they have immigrant parents who might identify with different cultures of different countries, might identify with different racial backgrounds. And a lot of my work has looked at what is that experience like? How do people navigate belonging to multiple groups when we often like to put people in one box? And then what I've been doing a little bit more now, so thinking about that kind of question across different identities as well. So sexual orientation and gender and how people evaluate more fluid identity experiences. So what I'm doing now is more of the perceiver side. So how do people think about it, feel about it? How does that influence intergroup relations more broadly? So that's kind of a lot of what I'm doing now. But I've dabbled in many different things. I'm interested in lots of aspects of intergroup relations.
That's great. I mean, it seems like a really understudied area of intergroup relations. We tend to talk about these social categories in isolation, but even just doing that, it kind of treats them as these kind of static things that can't be blended, or people can belong to multiple ones. So, uh, to my class, as we'll talk about later in the semester, we'll see emerging perspectives on just that. But I want to know a little bit more about the specific research you did in this context. And before we delve too much into the findings and the methods, can you give us a little bit of a background on how this project came about? It seems just like a really interesting way of studying these issues out in the real world.
Yeah, so this project was something that I worked on when I was a postdoc at Duke. So this was a project that had kind of already been in the works. Sarah Gaither, who was my postdoc advisor, she ran a similar study when she was a graduate student at Tufts and looked at the effect of roommate assignment, cross-race pairings on racial attitudes and behaviors. And she had the opportunity, she was contacted by Duke when they were thinking about changing their policy and was invited to study that before and after Duke enacted a change in whether students were able to select their roommate. So by the time I came onto the project, that was already all underway. So I played more of a role in like the data analysis and the writing and kind of later part of the project. But that was kind of the story of how the opportunity came about. So there were surveys that the university was already collecting, and they let our research team tack on way fewer than we would like questions onto those surveys. And then we were able to recruit a subset of participants across two cohorts to come into the lab and do an in-person study as well to see how these effects might play out in behavior.
Well, I think that's a cool backstory because it shows how, you know, many of these policy questions that people are tasked with making, they have real social psychological roots. And oftentimes when we're lucky, the social psychologist can be tapped on the shoulder and brought into these decisions because a lot of decisions in the real world have these social psych implications. So it's cool that you got to study it empirically here.
Yeah.
You mentioned not being able to measure everything that you wanted to, but you did get some interesting measures into the study itself. So it seems like typically in prior roommate studies, a lot of the outcomes have been just focused on intergroup prejudice, how much you like or don't like people from the group with which your roommate came from. But you were able to measure other things as well. So why do you think it was important to include other outcomes outside of just prejudice?
Yeah, I think that was one of the exciting parts of this project is that we're moving beyond just self-reported attitudes. We wanted to kind of move away from possible social desirability bias with just asking about prejudice and looking at things like friendship networks. One of the things with specifically roommate relationships that's kind of unique is it's kind of an intense relationship. You're living in a room with someone else. It's a lot of contact, it's a lot of time. And so there could be things like the people that they expose you to that could have trickle down effects. Like if you, and that's to preview, I guess, one of the findings is that people report more diverse friendship networks if they have a racial outgroup roommate. So we're tapping into some of that just by getting that initial measure. I think it would be really cool to study what that secondary contact is doing in a more longitudinal way.
Mhm.
Does it hold up, or is this a freshman year phenomena? So I think it's interesting to think about what in the real world, how does this actually play out in more than just self-reported attitudes?
Right. And so, yeah, that leads right into my next question that I want to ask you about is oftentimes the other people I talk to in this series, just because of the constraints of the studies that they have to run, they do a really good job of showing an effect. But all research has its limitations. You can't necessarily pin down the specific mechanism or processes that give rise to that effect. So one of the most consistent findings in your study was that having a cross-race roommate changes the racial composition of your own friendship network. You, above and beyond just your roommate, you report having more friends from other races. It could be a very straightforward story, but I like to give the expert the opportunity to elaborate on that. So how do you really think that this process unfolds? How do you get to that result from having a cross-race roommate?
Yeah, I think potentially the most straightforward explanation would be that your roommate is introducing you to their friends, right? And if they, we know that people tend to have mostly racially homogenous friendship networks. So that could be one way. It could be a more indirect way where you have more experience talking to someone from a different racial group. It could kind of reduce that intergroup anxiety that people have when they're interacting with a cross-race interaction partner. Maybe that makes you more confident or open to talking to someone new. That's a racial outgroup member. So it could be directly like, here are my friends, or it could be more indirect and just kind of working up the muscle of intergroup contact experience.
Right. So yeah, there's one straightforward explanation. You're just your roommate. You're getting along well enough with your roommate. Your roommate introduces you to some of their friends. Or it could just be this component of reducing the intergroup anxiety. You feel less anxious about interacting with people from another race. And so that leads to novel friendships outside of just your roommate's social network. It seems like you actually have some support for that latter interpretation a little bit in the in-lab study that you ran, where people
Mhm.
seemed, those who had experience with a cross-race roommate in turn showed more positive intergroup behaviors with a novel cross-race interaction partner. So very similar question to what I just asked you. Again, if you had to unpack it, if you had to speculate a little bit, what is the chain of events that goes from having a cross-race roommate to having more positive intergroup behaviors with a novel cross-race interaction partner?
Yeah. I mean, these things could all go together, right? So if it's that you have a cross-race roommate, you have more cross-race friends, it could be a similar thing where all of that experience is making you more comfortable in a novel context. And what I think is really cool about that finding is that for a lot of the sample, this was also generalizing to a different out group race. So because most of the way the in-lab section was set up, all the white participants interacted with a Black Confederate, but most of the white participants didn't have a Black outgroup roommate. I think Asian roommates were the biggest other group. So we didn't have enough to fully tease that apart to know whether this is transferring to a different group or if it's not. But generally, for most people, it was transferring to a new outgroup roommate. So maybe it's not just that, or sorry, to a new outgroup interaction partner. So it might not be just that you're it could, I think that also lends support for just being more comfortable or more familiar with interacting with people that are different than you and not necessarily specific cultural knowledge to one group or specific familiarity with one group. It seems to be more speaking to a broader mechanism of anxiety or ease and comfort.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. It's not a specific form of intergroup anxiety. Intergroup anxiety is more general. And so any practice with one form of intergroup interaction from a very optimistic perspective could generalize to a whole bunch of other groups. I wonder if it would generalize even across race. You would predict that would be the case, right? Other types of intergroup
Yeah,
dimensions, age,
right.
sexual orientation.
Yeah.
You'll have to test that in
The,
future research. Yeah, go on.
yeah. The other part of that design to point out is that they were talking about affirmative action and like kind of diversity focused topics. So it's also possible that the people who had a cross race roommate maybe have had more of those types of conversations, or they have more experience talking about that than someone who hasn't. And it also, we kind of set it up in a way that maybe that was bringing out their newfound comfort more.
Yeah, that makes sense as well. I wanted to return to something that you said earlier about while we might not see an effect on intergroup attitudes, and sure enough, you didn't see very strong effects on actual self-reported intergroup prejudice. Some aspect of that could be social desirability bias. These students know what the kind of normatively correct answer is to give on these, so maybe they're adjusting their responses. But there also could be more of a kind of a true null going on here in that the effects of having a cross-race roommate are more individualized or nuanced than just general feelings about intergroup prejudice. So how do you interpret those null results about not seeing an effect of having a cross-race roommate on self-reported prejudice?
Yeah, I it's an interesting null finding because if we see the effects on behavior but not on attitudes, it leads to an interesting contribution to the puzzle of the relationship between attitudes and behaviors, right? So it could be that maybe there's different mechanisms to those two outcomes, right? So for like behavior, it's more of this practice and lower anxiety, and that just doesn't translate to attitudes. Or people might be like when they're thinking about attitudes, they're subtyping their friends or their roommates. So they're not like they like this person, but that's not necessarily generalizing to everyone. I do think social desirability is probably the biggest part here, but it could be that there's different mechanisms that are allowing this to not impact attitudes, but impact behavior.
Right. I mean, for my class, I'll make a explicit callback to the work that we saw from Salma Musa, looking at the effect of playing on having an intergroup contact in terms of having cross-religion teammates on a soccer team. This was in Iraq, and there they
Mm-hmm.
found a very similar pattern. Increased behavior, felt positivity towards one's teammates, but not necessarily generalizing towards Christians or Muslims more generally. So much more research needs to be done to unpack those effects, but it does seem clear that there are many ways to change behavior outside of just changing attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, are there exciting next steps in this line of roommate research that you want to tell us about that, or that is either going to happen, or if you had your druthers, you would want to see happen?
Yeah, well, there's nothing in the works that I know of, but now I'm at Northeastern University, and so I think one of the things that I learned most from this, well, not most, but one of the things that I learned from this project was uh, what we started with that sometimes there's all this data lying around, or there's administrative decisions being made that social psychologists could really lend an important voice to, and so I have the goal to get more involved with how roommates are decided at Northeastern. Northeastern has a really interesting uh, co-op program and a lot of international students that begin their first semester internationally. So Northeastern has like a campus um, network. So there's like a London campus and several campuses across the US. So many students will start their first semester somewhere else and then come to Boston at the second semester. So I feel like that would be really interesting to see how does international experience or cross-cultural roommate in that sense at the very beginning of students' college careers impact the effects that they might have once they come back to their main campus. I'm also one of the other questions that was really interesting to me from this project was uh, the differences between the students who opted in and the students who did not opt into random assignment, some of the different effects of that. And it raised a big question of uh, who, like who opts in to random assignment? Is it because you're really open to experience and you want to meet somebody new, or maybe those people view the effects would be different than for students who opt in to a random assignment because they don't know anybody, or they maybe they're less socially open, right? Maybe they just want this taken care of for them. So I think there's a lot to learn about that and how that might be different. And then the amount of contact that people have had already, how that might influence something really an intense intergroup contact experience, like having a cross-race roommate. So if you already came from a high school that was really diverse and you already have a lot of experience, does a cross-race roommate, is that less impactful to you then? Or is this like really, is the impact stronger for students for whom this is the first time they're really experiencing in
Um,
close relationship.
those all really seem like interesting extensions. One thing that you brought up now that you're trying to run some extension studies in Northeastern, to think back to students in my own class, one change from the Duke University environment, and I can say this as a former Duke undergraduate, is that it's a little bit more isolated in terms of not being enmeshed within like an urban environment. But both Northeastern and McGill seem to be,
Mhm.
plopped right in the middle of a city. Pure speculation. Do you think that that environment changes the impact of one's roommate or not?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I guess it would give you potentially the opportunity to have more other ways of having cross-race exposure. So if you're, I can think in Boston, like I mean, it's very easy to have food from different cultures or go to festivals of different cultures, just many ways that maybe you could have more of that extended contact. Maybe your cross-race roommate isn't only introducing you to their friends, but is also taking you to the whatever festival or so maybe there it could kind of have a positive cycle in that sense. Um, I'm trying to think of like, is there a way to think about it being the opposite? Maybe in a more, I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not sure if in a more secluded space, that how that might differ. Maybe, yeah, the opportunity that you have to have cross-race contact and experiences.
Right. It could just also be that, where no matter where the university is located, people are very strongly enmeshed in their kind of university network. And so people mostly try and hang out with other students from
Yeah,
their university, even if they're in a wider urban area. But I'm sure my students will correct me about that if I'm wrong. Just to be mindful of your time here, one question I really like to end on, though, is there an issue or an idea that you really hope that research on intergroup relations uh, tackles or makes more advances in the years to come?
yeah. One of the things I'm interested in is I believe these findings. I think intergroup contact is a really powerful way to improve intergroup relations, but there's also some other work showing how the effects that this might have on social action and people's motivations to work towards bigger social change. And I think that's a really important area to keep puzzling over. I know some work that finds that people who have negative cross-race experiences are then really motivated to engage in social change. So I think that's something to keep thinking about. How can we harness a positive roommate interaction or roommate relationship to also facilitate social change? Without how can we have those positive, bigger change type of outcomes without having to have negative experiences across racial groups?
Right.
I don't
Yeah.
have an answer for it, but I think it's important.
No, that is like it really seems to be the $1 million question in this type of research. How can we maximize the benefits while minimizing the potential downsides? And so you will get to come back in a couple of years and tell us all about how you solved it. But for now, I'll just thank you very much for your time, Dr. Albuja, and hope to speak to you soon.
All right, thank you so much.